Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 6 of the MSI main stage. It's lower bracket round 2, and it kicks off here today. We are in our top 6 in terms of the teams that are remaining at this tournament, but at the end of today, we're going to be at our top 5, because it is an elimination series, of course, being in the lower bracket. Both of these teams coming from very different circumstances, but I'm excited to talk about it. I hope you guys are as well. This is a pretty fun matchup. I mean, there were only fun matchups left at MSI with all of the teams that are remaining, but I'm curious to know what you guys thought was going to happen in this series and whether or not the teams or the players lived up to your expectations in terms of their performances. Always curious to know where you guys land down in the comments section below, not just on my opinions, but on what yours were going into this and whether or not you feel like you predicted the series outcome or maybe were a bit surprised by how things ended up going. Always curious of that, but you guys know the spiel by now. It's day 6 of MSI, at least of the main stage. If you're here, you've probably watched a lot of the other videos, so let's go ahead and get into it. If you are new though, if you are somebody who hasn't watched my other MSI content, what we're going to do is go game by game in the series that we got yesterday, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we'll be looking at the bracket by the end of this, kind of talking about what direction these teams can go in, or I guess the team that wins goes in, because the loser is, of course, eliminated, and we'll kind of talk about what it means for the team that lost, to talk about what happened at this tournament and kind of just, go over their run and talk about whether or not that was a good or a bad run from them. But most of today will be spent talking about the games we got yesterday as per usual, so let's get into it. No need to waste time, or at least too much time at the beginning of the video. We had a really fun matchup, arguably the least interesting, at least on paper, the most predictable on paper of the series in this lower round 2, winners finals, this grouping of round 3, if you want to call it that. It was a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LPL in Anyone's Legend and the number 1 seed from the LCP in the CTBC Flying Oysters, and obviously there's a big favorite going into this one. I think of all the series that we're talking about over the next couple of days, this is the one that I think a lot of people understood the most, and that's mostly because AL is just so freaking good. This team is really, really highly rated. I got some comments on my previous video when I discussed the Gen G versus Anyone's Legend series that I was biased towards Anyone's Legend, that I was overhyping this team. Honestly, if that's what you think, that's your prerogative. I'm certainly not going to tell you that you're wrong, but I think you're crazy. If you genuinely think that you're looking at this team as anything less than a top 3 team in the world that played incredibly well against Gen G and just ran into one of the best teams in the world, the best team in the world in Gen G, then I don't know what to tell you. That's just my take. That's my opinion. I think right now I would take Anyone's Legend over anyone not named Gen G, definitely at this tournament, but maybe than anybody else in the world. Hanwha Life, I think at their best, could make an argument for it, but that's how good AL is right now. They're just so much more than the sum of their parts, and I think we've consistently been able to see that out of them. What they've shown us at this tournament is that they're not afraid of the spotlight. I think there was some concern that players like Shanks or KL that had never been to an international tournament before might not be able to live up to their domestic performances that they'd had internationally, but that's really not been the case. Both of them have been really good at this tournament. Hope, I think, has been really good at this tournament, even if he wasn't perfect in the final couple games against Gen G. I think Flandra has had some ups and downs, but generally he's been exactly what he was domestically, and I think his champion pool has been super predictable, which is overall a good thing, I would say, for Anyone's Legend. It means, a lot of those good tank performances and side lane performances that he was putting on in the LPL are very much repeatable. And then there's Tarzan, who is the guy for this team, not only in terms of what he was domestically, not only in terms of what he's been over the past couple of years of his career, which is, in my opinion, the best jungler in the world, but, what he is right now, which is, again, still the best jungler in the world, somebody who can consistently step up when he really needs to. Is he going to have bad games every once in a while? Yes, he's really aggressive as a player, which sometimes leads to more up and down games, but it's not quite as up and down as someone like Canyon. I think he's a little bit more stable than that, and his highs are arguably just as good, maybe a little bit worse than the highs of Canyon, but Tarzan's incredible. The most valuable jungler in the world, I think, is a better way to maybe quantify Tarzan. So everything kind of in favor of Anyone's Legend going into this series. I think most would agree with that. And then for the Oysters on the other side, this team has been shockingly good throughout the entirety of this year because their domestic play has just been okay. It's just been fine. They weren't infinitely better than teams like GAM or Talon domestically, which makes it so surprising that they can go international and just win, and just be better than a lot of those other teams. GAM had a lot of problems in the play-in stage. They didn't really look like a team that was going to be all that consistent. And so, I kind of had low expectations for the LCP coming into this tournament, and the Oysters have already kind of blown that out the water. They were definitely better than Koi when they faced them and knocked them out of the tournament. That's the number 1 seed from the LEC. And I get that Koi was like a weird number 1 seed. The LEC in general is just kind of in a weird spot right now. But, CFO is actually genuinely just like a top 10 team in the world right now, which is a very crazy thing to say. I don't think a lot of people would have expected that to be the case, but a lot of that is because the middle of their map is just so freaking good. Junjia has been so good at this tournament, and he's going to have to be today. Like, there's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Tarzan is the lifeblood of anyone's Legend, the focal point that they run basically everything through. If the Oysters are going to be relevant, if CFO is going to have a shot in this series, it's likely going to need to be through Junjia in the jungle. Luckily for him, like I said earlier in this tournament, he's probably having the best international run of his career right now. I know there have been some criticisms of him in the past where he's been able to dominate domestically in the PCS, but not be able to translate that internationally. That's not been the case in 2025. First Stand and MSI are his 2 best international tournaments ever, which I think are really good. It's a really good sign. It's a really good showcase that he is getting better and that it is something you can look out for in a positive way. I think you're looking at someone like Hongkyu being really good at this tournament. Is he going to make mistakes? Absolutely. He's super aggressive, super young. Sometimes he's just caught out of position, especially when he's playing from ahead, which I think is pretty funny. But overall, when he has a huge gold lead, he plays like he's just unkillable, and that's not always the case. But he is a very talented player. Mechanically speaking, he can go toe-to-toe with someone like Shanks in the mid lane. He's much more of a control mage player than someone like Shanks is, but he's still very, very good in that role. I think Driver's had an incredible tournament. He is clearly the better of the 2 top laners, but Rest, I think, can still do things. It's clear that they want to try and go for that 6-man roster and try to make it work. I understand why they want to do it. Not necessarily something I would go for. I think Driver just playing every game is probably better for this team, but what do I know? I'm not the coach. I'm not Chawi. I'm not a world champion. So, what do I know? And then you have Doggo and Kaiwing down on the bot side. Doggo's had some really good moments. I think his playstyle has been abundantly clear at this tournament, where he's an incredibly good early game player and he's very good at getting leads. He's just over aggressive in team fights. He's going to step too far forward. He's going to have to burn summoners for basically no reason, and he's going to get caught out in the back half of games. It's just kind of who he is as a player. It's what he's always been, even going back to his time in the LPL. And then Kaiwing is fine. He's had some bad games at this tournament. I think he's, for the most part, hidden by the fact that the rest of this team is good, but CFO have talent. They are a very good team. They're top 6 at this tournament for a reason. I just have a hard time believing that they're better than anyone's Legend. I think if they had drawn Billy Gaming or even like a T1 or something like that, like we saw in round 1, they can make it a lot more interesting, but that's just really not the case. Against AL, it's going to be a lot more difficult. That's why in this series, I predicted AL 3-0. I really do think that CFO is a good team. I just think AL is better, and that was my expectation, but we'll see if that can, become true, or if CFO maybe does a lot more than I'm giving them credit for and ends up winning a couple of games, if not the entire series, because this team has already pulled off some upsets at this tournament. But the only way to know how this ends up going down is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And this was a really fun game number 1. This was probably the best possible way to kick off this series in terms of playstyle, in terms of expectations. I was just having a lot of fun watching this game go down, and I think a lot of other people were as well. CFO clearly came to play here today. AL is a very good team that's very stable, very controlled, and does not give over advantages easily, and yet CFO was trying to claw things back piece by piece to get back into this game. It was just a little bit difficult. I think some of the mental trades that they made in the early game were incorrect from my perspective. I think trading dragons for essentially map pressure, gold, and herald was a mistake from CFO. I think that ended up really coming back to bite them, and I think outside of that, you also have a comp that needs to win early. I think there were a couple of picks. I'll say one pick in the draft that really ended up making it a little bit more difficult for them to win this game, but AL still had to go out there and execute, and I do think they did exactly that. If you are new here, we start off with draft when we talk about these segments, and draft is honestly pretty easy to talk about here. CFO have quite a lot going for them in the early game. Not only are you playing around Xin Zhao Talia, which is the most broken mid-jungle duo in the game. I think it is the strongest, and, I see a lot of people talking about Tabe draft gap, or, CFO's coach left them out to dry, and the players did the best they could. First and foremost, you can never blame coach entirely for draft. Pretending like players don't sit there and go, I would like to play this in this matchup, is absurd. We all know that that is the case. We all know that that happens, and so to sit there and just say that, like, oh, the coach screwed this game up for his players. Like, I think that that is a very, simplified way to look at the process. But even more so than that, how can I possibly be mad at a coach for taking Xin Zhao to Leo B1, B2? Like, I will never be upset at a coach for doing that. It's more so about the complementary pieces on this team that I think really ended up being a bit of a problem. I think the one pick that I really struggled to justify is the Misfortune on B4. You already know that it's Jin, Azir, especially with something like a Yorick on the top side. They're going to be able to stall out the game. They're going to be able to kind of push for those late game team fights a lot more consistently. You don't really have a way to punish them in the early game. And so picking Misfortune just feels kind of like a waste. Like, I don't really understand why you would ever go in this direction. I get that there were a lot of ADCs banned out, things like Caitlyn, Lucian, Ezreal, a lot of these other more aggressive lanes. But, I don't get why you want to go aggressive. I already don't think Misfortune does very well into Jin. And I think, Jin can kind of just scale that game out, and that adds on to the win condition of anyone's legend. But, pretending like we're upset over Xin Zhao Talia being B1, B2, I think is absolutely ridiculous. This combo has been dominant at this tournament. It's been super successful across this entire year, and really the only complaint I have is that you don't really have a way to win team fights outside of Talia and Xin Zhao getting really fed in the early game. And like I said, this would have been fine had they traded other objectives other than Dragon, where I think they just were never really going to be able to fight in the back half of the game. For AL, obviously they're looking for scaling here, but their draft is genius. I think Azir R1 was like pseudo punished here. Like, you drafted Azir with Talia up, which just feels wrong. Like, you should never basically do that. I think Talia is great into Azir, but I do think you kind of equalize that out with the fact that Poppy is really good into Xin Zhao. I think you can do a lot of really positive things there, and I think Yorick's in a great spot to be able to, like, run this game over. Even Jim is in a really good spot to be able to kind of calm the storm, and Bard's going to be able to be a playmaker in this one because Jin's not really take advantageable in the early game. He's not really going to be pressured out. He can play weak side really efficiently, and that means that Bard can move around, get a lot of resources, and Poppy can shut down Xin Zhao and Alistair and Talia and make it a lot more difficult for them to play the game. So overall, I just really like AL's draft. I wouldn't call it a mega draft gap because CFO got two of the strongest champions in the game, but I do think AL won draft, and I do think they, had an easier draft to execute on, specifically because they scaled so hard into the late game, and I think a lot of that comes down to Shanks and the setup that he ended up getting, which is why Tarzan is going to get my player of the game, and I think that might be a bit surprising to anybody who watched. He wasn't exactly the most flashy player in this game, but I certainly think he was the most consistent on the Poppy. Basically, every setup that they ended up getting was through Tarzan's positioning, and I think the Poppy ended up making CFO's comp really difficult to execute on. Kaiwing was way too early on some of these engages, and, Tarzan was the one to kind of punish that. Same thing for Junjie. He couldn't really play the game after 15 minutes, even though he was stacking dragons and had a lot more stats than, anybody on AL did. It was really hard for the Xin Zhao to ever really feel like he could get in and be functional because that Poppy was so dominant. So Tarzan being a great frontliner and also just generally being in the right place at the right time. He always has fantastic pathing and just natural map awareness. Like, I have really no other way to say that. Like, he's always really good at being where he needs to be. That kind of compounding onto the fact that he was playing a champ that really counters CFO ended up making him very useful. But I think it's reasonable to call out KL or Shanks as player of the game as well. KL on the Bard was incredible, ends up swapping over to Smite on the Summoner Spellbook to avoid Dragon Soul is the term I'm looking for, which was obviously a really big win for anyone's legend that basically won them the game right on the spot. We've seen Bard kind of pick up in prio over the course of this tournament. I think a lot of that is because he's such a great anti-dive tool. Like, if you're going to go for a lot of these big engages, Bard can really shut that off a lot more efficiently than even some of the other supports that are necessarily considered like anti-dive, things like Tom Kench. I think Bard is not only a more aggressive version of that, but also can do more, like, just generally on the map. So really like Bard as an option. I think Shanks played some of these later fights incredibly well. If he didn't make a couple of mistakes in the early game, he might have gotten player of the game because his late game was just really solid. Hope was also pretty consistent in this one. Jin's in a really good spot to not really make any mistakes, and Hope is the perfect player to not make mistakes and just kind of play alongside the rest of his team. Flandra was fine on the top side. This is a very good matchup for Yorick. I don't really understand why you're blinding Gragas top lane in game number 1. That feels like a very weird decision, but overall for AL, they got a comp that scaled and they executed it well. They ended up getting a lot of gold on the map in the mid game through Tarzan's decision making, whether that be through fights or specifically through Rift Herald and just being able to crack open basically every side lane where Yorick and Jin were already winning, and then obviously translating that gold lead into teamfight success in the late game. And for CFO, I get the idea of wanting to stack dragons. I just think it ended up being a little bit of a backfired approach because you didn't really have the combat stats to actually fight against the gold deficit that you were basically giving over for free. And I think on top of that, you don't really have any scaling in this game. Who's carrying your late game team fights? In CFO's case, it was Doggo, because the Misfortune ultimates were huge, and I know there are already people in the comment section that are yelling at me that I'm underrating how Doggo played in game 1. I thought Doggo was solid. He was definitely fine in this game, and there were a couple of huge bullet times that were set up throughout this game, but the problem is it's really hard for Misfortune to carry this. It was basically irrelevant whether or not Doggo played well or didn't. It's just not a game situation where Misfortune can take over and carry. That's why you needed Xin Zhao and Talia to be able to get leads in the early game, and that just didn't happen. Dud of the game can kind of go to anybody not named Doggo. I don't think it's Hongqiu either. I think he did fine on the Talia. It wasn't entirely his fault, but I'm giving it to Junjia just because it really did feel like a jungle gap in this game. It really did feel like the priority selection, like the target selection of resources that were going in the mid game was definitely in favor of AL, at least in terms of what their comp is and was. Like if AL had dragons, I would honestly be a little bit more on how they played the mid game if CFO was just getting this gigantic gold lead, because that's the thing that CFO needed to do, and Junjia just felt like he could take these dragons and start scaling and stacking for a soul win condition, but you can't really fight Azir, Bard, Yorick when you're down, 4k gold going into the late game. It's just a really hard trade to make, even if you do have a bunch of dragons. So Junjia being the one to kind of make those calls, I think ends up getting dead of the game for me. Even if he didn't play every fight brutally awful, like I just think that he was a little bit useless throughout this game. Driver also didn't look the way he did against Koi. I think that's fair to say. The Gragas did not look useful. Kaiwing was going way too far forward, way too quickly in these fights. You have to play these slow because you need gigantic bullet times. I think they just overestimated the damage that Misfortune can do in the back half of the game, and they kind of got punished for it. So for CFO, I think there's a lot to build on going into game number 2. Just some more acute target prioritization in terms of where your resources are going in the early game, understanding your comp a little bit better. I think this game was winnable. I just think that they ended up not playing it right. And then for Anyone's Legend on the other side, this was a really nice game number 1, very slow, very calculated, understanding exactly where they needed to be and taking that advantage. So are they going to be able to go up 2-0, or is CFO going to be able to fight back, because their mechanics at the very least in game 1 were still pretty solid? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, although they tried their absolute best to not do that here in game number 2, as this ended up being a game that was completely over by 15-20 minutes into the game, and then somehow, someway, Anyone's Legend has a 10k gold swing negative Baron play that completely throws the game back in favor of CFO, who then can't quite close out. AL ends up playing the final team fights just a little bit better and ends up taking the game. Absolutely unbelievable stuff from both of these teams. The fact that AL even had a chance to lose this game after 20 minutes is utterly absurd. This team was sitting on Ocean Soul. They were sitting on like an 8k gold lead at 25 minutes into the game, and somehow, someway, they ended up almost losing it because of one singular awful play coming in from one player, which we will obviously talk about, but we do have to get into draft first. That's how the order of these things go before we talk about the gigantic throw that ended up happening, and we can kind of talk about why I think there was a reason to expect at least CFO to have more pressure in the late game, because double marksman plus rumble is almost always going to be difficult to deal with in these team fights, especially around these closed off areas. That being said, they should have had no business playing them really at any point. I'm not saying that they should have won these. I'm just saying that, it makes sense that even though Kaiwing and Hongqiu played the early game just about as bad as you possibly can, and, basically throw away the entire game for their team by making some gigantic mistakes, it doesn't really matter. You have a Kai'Sa who's probably going to be in a really good position going into the latter half of this game. I've said it a lot, but Kai'Sa's actually a pretty decent answer to Lucian, all things considered, because her biggest problem, and the reason that she's considered weak in the laning phase, is her lack of range and her lack of ability to actually trade. That's not as much of a problem when you're going into Lucian. Obviously, he's still going to win a lot of the early trades, but Kai'Sa's actually a lot more formidable because, you don't really have that gigantic range disadvantage like you do against a lot of other AD carries early on in the game. So I think Kai'Sa's in a pretty good spot. I also think CFO, of course, scale really well. If you do end up getting to the late game relatively neutral, I think you should be able to win a lot of these team fights as long as you execute on, which we will talk about. But for Anyone's Legend, you've got the macro, masterclass mid-game power spike comp of your dreams. Like, what else do you even really want me to say? You've got Ryze, Galio as your solo lane duo. Those are two of the best macro threats in the entire game right now. You should be able to open up the map in gigantic ways. Shanks was really good in the early game, had some fantastic moments on Rise. Hope actually ends up getting gigantically fed in the early game. Kaiwing massively misplays an early 2v2 that basically gives Hope 2 kills at level 1, and from that point onwards, the Lucian's in such a dominant spot that he's able to continue to move forward. And I think from a draft perspective, they did play this out well, and the fact that they were able to stack those dragons and really secure a lot of their scaling going into the late game. The problem is that they make one absolutely unbelievable error at Baron, and if you've seen the game, you already know what it is. This team is up, like I said, 8k gold. They have Ocean Soul at this point. They're on Baron. It goes down to about 4k. CFO is posturing around because they have to try and get this fight, because if they give up Baron, the game is absolutely over. And what does anyone's Legend do? What does Tarzan in particular do? He peels off the Baron, full engages onto the Skarner, immediately gets CC'd. Flandra and KL immediately going after him, and they all die. Like, it's one of the single biggest ints I've ever seen. There's no other word I can possibly use for it. It's one of the worst engages that has ever happened in the history of professional League of Legends. Tarzan's brain went full monkey mode. You can't put Tarzan on a monkey in Wukong and have him, not make some sort of ape-like decision in the back half of this game, because what just, how do you even explain that? There is no justification for that play ever being made. That alone individually should have thrown the entire game for anyone's Legend, but CTBC, to their credit, threw it right back to anyone's Legend as they were pushing with the Baron. Kaiwing ends up making a pretty horrible engage on the Nautilus, ends up dying, and the game is over from there. Anyone's Legend still able to pull it out in the end, but this was not a good game from either of these two teams. I mean, it was a great game from AL up until the Baron. You don't get an AK gold lead in Ocean Soul on accident. That's something that you do actually have to go and perform on. But the fact that they at any point could have lost this game, and quite frankly should have lost this game after that Baron, is just completely inexcusable. That being said, Hope's player of the game, I'm not blaming Hope for this one. He did everything he was supposed to do. I'm sure Lucian was looking on at the Wukong and Galio and Nico going in and killing themselves and being like, I don't know what to do. What do I do about this situation? I certainly don't blame him. He was super aggro throughout basically all of this game, specifically in the mid game. Did a great job of actually pushing pressure. Shanks was also pretty good on the Rise. I think Tarzan had a great game up until he completely threw it away. That being said, he could earn dead of the game almost entirely for that play, because he should have lost the game on the spot. Same for Flandra and KL. They absolutely should not have followed up. No justification for that ever happening. But it didn't matter. AL still ended up winning anyways. They got lucky to get bailed out of a situation that they put themselves in, and hopefully they're going to be able to turn that around and, keep their mental clear. They still are 2-0 in this series, so it can't really be all that bad. And for CFO, how tilting is this, that you were basically gifted a win here in game number 2 after being destroyed for the entirety of the game, and you still can't win it? You still can't come out and win the game. I know there's going to be some people that really praise how Doggo played in this one, and I get, the Kai'Sa was generally fine. I think, Doggo getting caught at the end there was pretty bad overall. His positioning during that Baron push was terrible. Both of the bot lane members were. But overall, how can you feel good about CFO? They got blasted in this game. The only reason they had a chance to win it is because anyone's Legend were absolutely horrendously awful in the back half of the game, and they still couldn't win it. It's not really a good look for either team, specifically CFO, though. Kaiwing's gonna get dead of the game. I would give this to Tarzan if Kaiwing didn't throw the game in multiple different phases. Not only did he get, basically engage on a 2v2 in the bot lane that gets Hope 2 kills early on that lets the Lucian play super aggressive, not only did he completely throw that first dragon fight by being in a horrible position alongside Hongq getting caught out in River. Not only did he throw the Baron by, stepping up a little bit too far forward and get bailed out by Tarzan peeling off, but he also threw the Baron push by engaging and getting caught out there with Doggo. Kaiwing made mistake after mistake after mistake. This is genuinely one of the worst games of the entire tournament. All he needed to do was be an average player, and it wasn't there in game number 2, and I think that is the biggest reason why he is getting dead of the game. Tarzan would get it in 90% of circumstances, but Kaiwing really was that bad, in my opinion, in game number 2 here. I think it's also worth pointing out that Junja has no pressure throughout this entire game on the Skarner. I get that he ends up making the big play in that fight. I'm not giving CFO credit for that fight. Tarzan basically threw the game away. There's really no reason to be like, oh, well, CFO capitalized well. Junja hit his ult on Tarzan. Well, of course he did. He jumped right on top of him, so I'm not giving him credit for that. Hongq's scoreline is entirely fraudulent. He had a lot of damage in the back half of the game, but he had 2 really awful plays. He gets solo killed by Shanks in the mid lane, and then also gets caught out alongside Kaiwing early on in the game. Driver had a couple of nice ults ultimates. That's kind of the biggest positive I can say, but like CFO didn't play this game well. The fact that they were in it was entirely on Anyone's Legend attempting to throw it, and even then, CFO still couldn't capitalize, and now they're down 0-2. It does feel like the mental of this team is a little bit broken after game 2. That's got to be one of the most tilting and, lackluster experiences you could possibly have in a game number 2, so we'll see how they rebound going into game 3, and for Anyone's Legend, just clean this shit up, man. Like, there's no reason for a team this good to be making a mistake that large. This game absolutely should have been thrown, and they won anyways. Can they close it out in 3 and kind of erase a lot of people's memories of that play, or is CFO going to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was CFO. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive at the very least for one more game, make the series 1-2, and they're going to do it in great fashion. They finally won a game that they absolutely controlled from start to finish. They were better in this game than Anyone's Legend. I think that was abundantly clear, and especially coming off of game 2, it's really amazing that they kept their mental. I think most teams would have probably just insta-lost game 3 after the way game 2 ended, where they were basically destroyed, gifted a free victory, and still threw that away. For them to be able to come out in game 3 and actually, just win it, like just be better in this game, I think is really impressive, and a lot of credit to the players, which obviously I will talk about. For Anyone's Legend on the other side, I'm not too worried, but honestly, games 2, 3, not looked all that great. This is certainly not the same team that showed up against Genji earlier on in the tournament. I think a lot of people, once again, called me biased for, saying AL was really good. Maybe this is a series that they're going to use to point to that example. I'm more than willing to, open my mind to see that these teams could or could not be anywhere from number 2 to number 4 in the world, right? Like, there's a big cluster in the upper echelon right now, so we'll see, because games 2 and 3 have not looked great from Anyone's Legend, but it's nice to see CFO being able to come up and pull a game out of this series. I think after game 2, like I said, I really expected this to be a 3-0, because not just because I predicted it going into the series, but because of just how game 2 ended. So for them to just be better, I think is a really great sign, and I think it's on a lot of different reasons. These drafts are relatively even. I think both of these teams have advantages in a couple of areas. I would slightly favor Anyone's Legends draft, because I do think that while both of these teams want to scale into the late game, playing around Gwen Xayah for AL, and then playing around Orianna and Ezreal for CFO, I think they do it in slightly different ways. I think the Annie is just super, super good into Orianna. I think this is always going to be an absolutely gigantic mid-jungle advantage for Anyone's Legend, as long as they play it relatively okay. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Like, the Lee Sin was not very good in this game. Shanks had a couple of moments that were good, but also was flash stunning really bad targets throughout a lot of these team fights. But theoretically, I think AL has the minor lead because Annie should be a lot more proactive than something like Orianna is, but if CFO can generate that lead, I think both of them scale about as easily in the same direction. I think it's harder for Xayah to play the game than it is for something like Ezreal. This is a pretty nightmare Xayah comp to draft her into. I don't really like the draft decision here. I think Xayah is very playable as a champion. I just don't think this is a very good draft for the champion, but overall, like, CFO just ends up executing their comp better, and I think it all comes down to two players who just had phenomenal games. First and foremost, player of the game is going to Doggo. Absolutely unreal performance from him. It's really cool to see that, Doggo as a player just remembers how to play League when he leaves the LPL. It is very funny because obviously he was such a hyped prospect back in the day in the PCS, ends up getting a contract to play for Billy Gaming, kind of a six-man situation to play alongside Uzi for BLG, and ends up being okay in that role. I would say he was a slightly below average LPL AD carry, somewhere around like the 10 to 12 mark in terms of LPL AD carries, and then he goes over to some bad teams in Ultra Prime and just can never really find his footing. I was defending him up until his final year in the LPL. I think there is going to be some revisionist history. I've already seen that online where people are like, oh, Doggo was just on a bad team and, he never really got the credit he deserved. Doggo was pretty shit last year. Like, this guy had the worst year of his entire career in 2024. He did not look like a competent AD carry. He looked like somebody that needed to be benched in the LPL, probably a bottom 3 AD carry, like number 14 or 15 in the LPL last year. And so to see him go back home, go back to in this case, the LCP, get to play for the Oysters and actually step up and start to recapture some of that magic he had back before he left for the LPL in the first place. It is kind of fun to see that be the case because his Ezreal is just absolutely dynamic. The way he's able to play these fights is ridiculous. And it's funny because it's very clear why Ezreal is such a good pick for him. It fits perfectly into his playstyle. Doggo's biggest issue was that he's constantly caught out in team fights, stepping too far forward and trying to put out too much damage. And so having a champion that can just blink their way out of a team fight has like a free escape tool, you know, really positive for Doggo because it allows him to step up a tad bit more and be a bit more aggressive. You know, champions with a bit of mobility like that always really work for those more aggressive players, and Doggo obviously just looks way more comfortable. He played these fights about as well as you can. I do want to give a big shout out to Junjia though. I thought this was easily his best game of the series up until this point on the Trundle. Actually was just able to control a lot of space. Couple of pillars this game that were absolutely ginormous overall for fights, and overall I just think he controlled the map well. Like, again, this was a mid-game dominant kind of game for CFO where they were able to get their big lead, and I think that is in a large part thanks to the jungler from my perspective. Honkyu had a pretty solid game. I don't love this game for Orianna. Like I said, Annie's really great into Ori. She should basically always be on the back foot in terms of the plays that are being made around the map, but because Trundle was so active, you know, you could play through the middle of the map just a tad bit more, and it opened up the Orianna to scale a little bit more effortlessly. Couple big shockwaves down the stretch of this game. Kaiwing was fine, certainly turned it around from that horrendous game number 2, and, you know, Rest made some mistakes in the early game here, coming in and playing the Nard, but for the most part, it was okay. CFO had enough pressure elsewhere to kind of ignore the fact that they're playing their weaker top laner, and for anyone's Legend on the other side, just a couple of pretty big mistakes. I think Tarzan had a pretty bad game overall on the Lee Sin, which is why he's getting dead of the game. No tempo and no pressure. I think especially on Lee, you need to make sure that not only your Gwen and Xayah are in a good spot, but that you're utilizing Annie pressure to be able to move around the map, making sure that she has push in the mid lane to fight over objectives, or to just transition that into side lane control through Gwen or through Xayah. Didn't really feel like Tarzan and Shanks had a ton of desire to link up throughout a lot of this game, and I think that that was a pretty gigantic mistake, and Tarzan is going to be the one to pay the price for that. Like I said, Shanks was okay, but definitely could have done more. A couple of flash engages, like I said, flash stuns in these fights, just on non-priority targets, hitting things like the Braum or the Trundle or the Orianna, just anything but the Ezreal, which I think was a gigantic mistake from Shanks if he is going to try to make those aggressive plays. Hope never really got online. You know, this is a tough Xayah game. Flandra couldn't really do anything. KL made a couple of big mistakes early as well in this B1 rel. You pick it early because Alistair is already taken off the board for Fearless, and you don't really feel like there's better engage supports on the other side, but there's pretty easy ways to mitigate rel engage overall. So for AL, they just kind of lost game 3. It's not quite as interesting of a story as game 2 was, but they're still up in the series 2-1. If they can come back and, you know, win game number 4, things are going to be all fine. But CFO, you know, I thought their mental was going to be destroyed. It clearly wasn't. If they can go out and win game 4, now not only are you a team that's sitting in a pretty good spot at 2-2 with momentum, but AL's confidence has got to be shattered. They should have lost game number 2, and if they lose game 3 and game 4, now you're looking at a team that kind of probably feels like they should have lost this series 3-1. So this is kind of a must-win for AL, and CFO really need to do this to stay alive, obviously, in this tournament. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series 3-1, and they are going to move on to lower bracket round 3. CFO, unfortunately, to all of their credit, is out in top 6 at this tournament. They played really, really well throughout this entire tournament, kind of piggybacking off of their great showing at first stand. This is a team you have to take seriously for the rest of the year. I'm not saying that they're Flash Wolves in terms of what this team could be for this region, but they're certainly the closest that this region has come since Flash Wolves to being as relevant as they are, and I think that that is a really big positive overall for the Oysters, for these players, and for the LCP in its first year in existence. But anyone's Legend was just a bit better here today. They finally had a performance where they looked really good, kind of similar to game 1 where they were just better, but I think this game was more dominant. Really some mistakes made by CFO, some pretty big ones that ended up leading to their loss, and then AL kind of capitalizing on it. That being said, when we talk about draft, I actually really favor CFO's draft in this one. Everybody glazes Tabe because, rightfully so, this guy's got a great mentality. His ability to lead players, I think, is ginormous, but his drafts do sometimes get a bit overhyped, at least from my perspective. I've talked about this domestically. This is a draft that I think is okay in terms of what its execution is, but really I think it's harder for AL to win this game than it is for CFO. I think when you're looking at individual matchups, like Sivir into Jinx is one of those completely neutral, like nothing happening matchups. You can spell shield the Blitzcrank hook. This really shouldn't be a lane that has any sort of action. In the early game, you can't really play around either of these two unless there's a massive mistake, which Doggo makes, which obviously we will talk about. Cassante is pretty good into Jace, all things considered. I think this is a very positive matchup for Cassante, and I've always thought that Aurora plays really well into Sylas, outside of the fact, you know, that Sylas will scale into the late game. And so you don't really have any lanes that you feel like you can play through, but AL don't like, they have scaling. I want to make that clear. You have Jinx, you have Maokai, you know, you have things that you can play for in the late game. I feel like CFO's team fight is a little bit easier, at least from my perspective. Like Thresh, Jarvan, Cassante going in to just set up for like a Sivir Aurora win condition, to me feels easier to execute on than hoping and praying that you can keep Jinx safe with a bunch of playmakers like Jace and Sylas moving around the map. Like, I don't know, it just feels a bit more disconnected. I think if it was something other than Jace on the top side of the map, I probably would have liked the draft more coming in from AL, but, you know, I don't think it really mattered. Like, AL just kind of outperformed them. Even if Shanks did make some mistakes in the early part of the game, Hongq actually had a pretty good one here for CFO. It just didn't really matter. Player of the game can kind of go to anybody. This was more of a team effort than it was like an individual effort for AL. I think Shanks had the best plays in game number 4. I think he was the one that was doing the most in the back half, like him being able to kill Rest to get back into the game after a pretty bad teleport and then kind of taking over that final dragon fight was really big for anyone's legend. But I think he was kind of behind in the early game, and so I can't really give him player of the game. I'm giving it to Tarzan, who's also somehow getting player of the series for me in terms of my calculations. Very funny how that works out, because he tried to throw game number 2 and then also was not very good in game number 3 on the Lee Sin, but you have to remember, like 2.75 of these 4 games, he was arguably the best player on the Rift. He was incredible in game 1 on the Poppy. He was great in game 4 here on the Maokai. And for the most part, in game 2, he was super good on the Wukong until he just decided to throw the game away. And so you have to give him some credit for being the most relevant player towards anyone's Legends advantages throughout this series. But, you know, you do have to talk about the Wukong and the Lee Sin as maybe not being perfect. But Tarzan's player of the game or player of the series for me, both of them. The Maokai was really good here. Maokai's been super successful at this tournament. If you wanted to give Hope player of the series, he's the really only other player that I would consider here. The Jinx was solid in game 4. Didn't really have to do anything, if we're being entirely honest. This champion was not particularly useful in this game. It was doing damage, but like not in a way that was hyper carry levels of damage. KL had a couple of nice hooks, especially once Kaiwing had to burn his flash later on in the game. Really no way for the Thresh to be able to survive those engages. Like I said, Shanks made some big plays down the stretch, and Flandra was also fine on the top side. Wasn't really in that bad of a spot overall, considering how bad the matchup is, in my opinion, for Jace, but for anyone's legend, it's just going to be nice for them to be able to end this series on a positive note after game 2 and game 3 kind of weren't exactly the most encouraging signs of all time. And then for CFO on the other side, it's pretty easy to see where they went wrong in this game. They just got outplayed. A couple of players really had some underwhelming performances, and they can't really afford to do that against anyone's legend. In game 3, they played really well as a unit, and, you know, if you have any sort of lackluster, you know, performances, it's just kind of going to get doomed against AL. That's going to go to rest on the top side. Dead of the game, I should say, is going to go to rest on the top side. Pretty unfortunate turn of events, but man, I'm really just not impressed with Rest. Rhyme totally not intended there, but like I don't feel good about him as a player. Driver is so clearly better. This team would be better as a 5-man unit than they would be as a 6-man unit, especially in the back half of these series. If you're going to play Rest, at least play him at the beginning of the series when games matter less. Like putting him in a game that kind of decides whether or not you're going to be alive at this tournament and letting him play Cassante, like it's just a lot of pressure for a player who has been probably the worst top laner at this tournament. Like it's really just not been a good look. So, you know, he's done of the game. That teleport into the mid lane really blew the game wide open for AL and really kind of destroyed every chance that CFO had of getting back into this. Doggo also getting caught around, I believe, first dragon or second dragon, one of the two as Sivir. That was game shattering. Like that opened up the map entirely for anyone's legend. Doggo just can't really be making those kinds of mistakes. This is what I was talking about. He steps too far forward and gets caught out all the time. He just gets away with it when he's playing Ezreal or, you know, Xayah, champions with mobility. He looks a lot better on those champs because he can kind of avoid his own mistakes, but on champions like Sivir, you don't have that same kind of luxury. I also think that, you know, Kaiwing wasn't great in this series, and Kaiwing is definitely another weak link for this team. Junja, Hongq, Doggo at his best. Like, those players are really good and good enough to compete with the upper tier teams at this tournament. It's clear that, you know, Rest and Kaiwing in particular just aren't on the same level as the rest of the team. Junja was fine. Hongq had a really good game on the Aurora, just couldn't really do anything after Sylas got back into the game. Very difficult to play that out, especially because you were the only form of damage and your Sivir was basically useless in the back half of the game, so for CFO, it just is what it is. They tried their absolute best to be able to maintain some pressure and some success, and honestly, they put up a great fight here today. There is a chance that they could have won 2 different games against the winners of the LPL. That's a very good sign for CFO. This team is everything that they should be at this tournament. There's no way you can look at their performance, the Oyster's performance, and say anything other than that they are overperforming right now in terms of what their expectations are, especially considering what they've been domestically, which is good, but not like dominant in the way that they have been internationally. It's just really cool to see that players like Hongkyu and Junja and Doggo can have these pop-off performances and really kind of step up to the plate against some of the best teams in the world. It's just not quite enough. AL was a pretty rough draw, and they're going to be moving on to lower bracket round 3. There are a lot of things they need to fix, but this was their weakest series at the tournament up until this point. I think there's reason to believe that it's more of an outlier than it is the expectation for anyone's Legend, and I think a lot of their calm and controlled play style is going to come back later on. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Round 2 lower bracket Day 1, I guess, overview and analysis video. It's Day 6 overall of the tournament. You guys know what you were signing up for getting into this one. It was AL and CFO, and anyone's Legend is moving on with a 3-1 victory, and that means they're moving on to lower bracket Round 3. They will take on the winner of tomorrow, or I guess today's matchup that we are going to preview right now between Billy Gaming and FlyQuest, and talk about the most interesting series of the entire tournament up until this point. BLG really shit the bed against T1 in terms of their performance. They looked exactly like what the worst of them looked like in the LPL, which is a team that's pretty good at generating early advantages and has good hands for the most part in individual lanes, but has no idea what they're doing after 20 minutes and do not play as a team. And the problem with that is that FlyQuest's biggest advantage as a team is that they're really good at delaying games. They are very good at slowing the pace of the game down and making it so that their early games that aren't very good are not really all that exploitable. And also they're really good at macro calls and at team fighting in the back half of the game. That's BLG's biggest weakness. This is a good matchup for FlyQuest. I honestly am scared for BLG. I think if there was ever a time where a Western team was going to be able to beat one of the Eastern teams at a tournament like this year, this could be the kind of matchup that ends up lending itself in that direction. FlyQuest is in incredible form right now, and I really do believe that there is a chance they win this. I just can't predict that because as much as I like FlyQuest, I don't think they can be considered favorites going into an LPL team. It just feels insane. A top 2 team from the LPL. BLG are better in every lane. Specifically, watching Quad play against Caps and get destroyed in that series, even though Fly was winning everywhere else, makes me very concerned for how he's going to play in tonight. I think that could be a very bad matchup overall for FlyQuest, and I think Bin versus Bwipo, that's a very Bin-favored matchup. Elk and On into Masu and Busio, like that's a very BLG-favored matchup. You know, Inspired being better than Beichuan matters, and I do think that that is, you know, FlyQuest's avenue, is that if Inspired is really great, he could be like the most relevant player on the Rift in terms of his like differential between him and his opposing player, and if that's the case, that's how FlyQuest wins. But for now, I have to assume BLG is going to win it, but I am going to go pretty aggressive. I'm going to go BLG 3-2. I think this goes to 5 games. I think FlyQuest is good enough to take at the very least 1 game off of BLG, if not multiple, if not win the entire series. If Fly wins, don't be surprised. This is the closest a Western team is going to get to beating an LPL or an LCK team at one of these international tournaments. So we'll see if Fly can live up to the hype and the potential, or if BLG is just going to turn it on and show that the LPL is so different, you know, from the West that it's not even really close. Even BLG at their worst can beat FlyQuest at their best. I'm curious to see if that's the case, but let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering every single day of MSI. That includes tomorrow with BLG versus Fly, and then of course Gen G T1, the rest of the tournament. You know how it goes. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on at MSI, and then after with all the major regions, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all